Where did you grow up?
I still haven't.
Ah, excellent.
Yeah, I
Excellent.
think it's the definition of mature. Two things about maturity, and we know there's nothing about. The one is that I want to become really mature just about 5 minutes before I die. But one of the other things, and it does tie back, is that I was reading something last year about that a true sign of maturity is when you actually say no. When you've actually gotten to the point where you feel so comfortable about where you stand on an issue that you say, no, I'm not going to do that. No more. I can't take enough of that. That you crossed all of my spiritual, my emotional, my philosophical, all those boundaries. I've said no. And that all comes back to the low carb. When now nearly 10 years ago, I started talking about the perils of sugar, which rolled into sugar, carbs, seed oils, and that whole role of inflammation. And when everyone around me was telling me that I was wrong, I mean, my medical colleagues were saying, look, you've lost the plot about this sugar stuff. Would you get off that bandwagon? You can't treat diabetes by diet and lifestyle, even though it's a type 2 diabetes is a lifestyle related disease. And, as I've often say, once you see the results of low carbing, particularly in diabetes, but across a range of issues, you can't unsee it. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean that I haven't seen it. And so that word no came into my existence several years ago, but only last year I realized it was actually a sign of maturity, that you actually, once you've worked out, no more, I'm not going to put up with it. And so without being completely and utterly arrogant, but that's what surgeons are good for, but I mean, without being completely arrogant, when I saw all this stuff, I said, we have to do it. And I don't care how many obstacles we're going to come up against. I'm right, you're wrong.
Welcome to the herd, and thanks for listening. We're happy to help you have informed conversations with your healthcare providers. But please do not treat anything we say in this or any of our episodes as medical advice. Even when the guests are physicians, they're not your physician. If you enjoy this sodcast, please like it, share it, give it a good rating, and follow, and help more people find their way into the Ruminati herd. If you have suggestions for improvements, please let me know. Howdy, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Meet Your Herdmates Sodcast. Today, I'm so pleased to be joined by Dr. Gary Fettke, all the way from the future. It's Sunday morning and it's Saturday afternoon here, so figure that one out. Wonders of technology. How are you doing, Gary?
Good morning / good afternoon. Yeah, I'm very well.
Good. Good. We've already been having a pretty good visit, so we figure we better start on this or we're going to miss all the best stuff, including the fact that I'm already behind in the score. Maybe we'll explain that as we go along. For those who don't know who Gary Fettke is, he's an orthopedic surgeon practicing in Tasmania, Australia. He has a major interest in preventative medicine. In recent years, Gary has focused on and spoken out about the role of diet in the development of diabetes and other chronic diseases. This advocacy has not been without cost, but along with his wife, Belinda, he continues to advocate for the role of unbiased nutritional information and what it can do in addressing the many problems that we face between now and 2050. So welcome.
Good. Well, thank you. Thanks for the welcome again. And it's great to catch up. I mean, we're not really seeing each other face to face as we have in the last few years, but the Zoom means we can talk and not have to pay too much attention to actually how we look.
Yeah, exactly. Plus, especially when you just make an audio only version of this for podcast, most people won't see us anyway. But so,
well, that's one of the great tragedies of this low carb lifestyle, LCHF, keto, is that at the end of it, I'm a lot healthier, but I'm still not good looking.
Yeah. The line about I once was a 56-year-old or whatever it was, balding, obese, pre-diabetic, and today I'm still balding.
That's right.
Where's the miracle? Dang it. Not so much. Actually, I'm very pleased with all the other results. So I have no problem suggesting it to people. So where did you grow up? Did you grow up in Tasmania?
I still haven't.
Ah, excellent.
Yeah,
Excellent.
I think it's the definition of mature. Two things about maturity. And we know there's nothing about the one is that I want to become really mature just about 5 minutes before I die. But one of the other things, and it does tie back, is that I was reading something last year about that a true sign of maturity is when you actually say no. When you've actually gotten to the point where you feel so comfortable about where you stand on an issue that you say, no, I'm not going to do that. No more. I can't take enough of that. That you've crossed all of my spiritual, my emotional, my philosophical, all those boundaries. I've said no. And that all comes back to the low carb. When now nearly 10 years ago, I started talking about the perils of sugar, which rolled into sugar, carbs, seed oils, and that whole role of inflammation. And when everyone around me was telling me that I was wrong, I mean, my medical colleagues were saying, look, you've lost the plot about this sugar stuff. Would you get off that bandwagon? You can't treat diabetes by diet and lifestyle, even though it's a type 2 diabetes is a lifestyle-related disease. And, as I've often say, once you see the results of low carbing, particularly in diabetes, but across a range of issues, you can't unsee it. Now, just because you can't see it doesn't mean that I haven't seen it. And so that word no came into my existence several years ago, but only last year I realized it was actually a sign of maturity, that you actually, once you've worked out, no more, I'm not going to put up with that. And so without being completely and utterly arrogant, but that's what surgeons are good for, but I mean, without being completely arrogant, when I saw all this stuff, I said, we have to do it. And I don't care how many obstacles we're going to come up against. I'm right, you're wrong. Yeah.
What is the nexus between an orthopedic surgeon and diabetes?
Well, it's central. We've got not just diabetes, we've got 3/4 of the population that are probably pre-diabetic now. And just because there's a number that defines when you've got diabetes, and that's mostly dependent around the HbA1c test, which some people may know about, but nonetheless, it's just a number which is plucked out of the air. But when you really go looking at people and doing the right testing, which is a Kraft insulin test, we don't need to talk about that, you find out that 3/4 of the population are probably insulin sensitive, heading towards that insulin resistant state, and are pre-diabetic. So just because you don't have diabetes, you've got the risk factors, and you're going to get it if you don't look after yourself. And from an evolutionary point of view, having that state of insulin at the ready has actually been very good evolutionary wise. And we can almost go off on so many different tangents.
Yes. Yes. But you as an orthopedic surgeon, diabetes comes in when you're treating advanced stages of that disease.
Well, no, early stages as well, Peter.
Okay.
The glucose and sugar, which are the two, fructose, glucose and fructose, but glucose and fructose together is called sugar. Glucose and fructose in combination affect your immunity and your healing potential and your white cell activity within minutes of actually eating them. So there's one of the white cells is called neutrophils. They're actually a cell involved in the whole healing process. And if you eat carbohydrate, just 50 grams of it, it reduces their activity dramatically. If you fast, it actually improves their activity for 72 hours. So I'm operating on people all the time. And ideally, I'd like them to fast for 72 hours after their operation. Nobody will ever do that. But that you can actually look at immunity and it keeps improving for hours after surgery. But what do we do when we wake patients up after an anesthetic? What's the food we give them in hospitals? We give them white bread, we give them orange juice, we give them a chocolate chip cookie, we give them a bit of jelly, we give them a bit of ice cream, which at a cellular level is actually slowing their immunity up. It constricts the blood vessels when you want them to be open. It gives them a high sugar, which doesn't help the healing. And then they drop down again and they feel crook an hour or two later. We do the dumbest things in medicine all the time. It's just, but on a day-to-day basis, if you've got diabetes or pre-diabetes, you're at risk of more complications. You're certainly ending up with a population in society which is overweight and obese. Effectively, 90% of knee replacement patients done in Australia are overweight or obese. 74% of hip replacements. That's our latest figures. So the vast majority of people we're operating on are overweight and obese with their incumbent problems. And I know it's the same in the US, but you've got one surgeon advertising that their technique's better than another surgeon's. You know, robots are better than my robot's better than your robot. And hospitals are saying that, the way we treat people is better than or worse than another. It's absolute nonsense when you in fact realize that 90% of the population that you're operating on are overweight and obese. And that's the biggest factor that will determine outcome. So we've got to address that before we start saying that, I'm a better surgeon than you're a better surgeon. It's just, this is what I find this very frustrating in medicine when, particularly surgery, where people are going off and insurers are paying millions and billions of dollars in band-aiding sick care, when in fact we're not going back to the root cause, which is what we eat. And if what we eat improves, then our health improves. We won't need the surgery and we won't develop the complications. I mean, I've yet to find anybody in the health insurance industry that says it's a viable one.
So, but once upon a time, weren't you the cake judge?
Oh, I think, okay, we're now playing the game again. You want to go back to 1-0? I used to be the cake judge at the hospital. And in fact, if you had a broken arm, particularly children, they'd come in to say, and they'd say, how long am I in plaster? And I say, look, you've got 6 weeks in plaster if you bring me a chocolate cake. Otherwise, it's 8 weeks. So it was out and out bribery, but it was part of the distraction of kids when, worried about having their plasters taken off. But on Fridays in the clinic at the hospital, I'd often have 6 or 8 cakes that we needed to move around. So, I was a really nice guy. I'd go and, I'd take the best one home. I was 20 kilos heavier, which is 50 pounds heavier than where I am now. I'd take the best one home. We'd take them around to the nursing staff and bribe them. Otherwise now, in retrospect, now go out and poison everyone around me. So I am trying to make amends for that probably best part of 20 years of poisoning society and encouraging it to be poisoned.
Fair enough. But another scandalous thing I've heard you say is that you follow a plant-based diet.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that has a certain meaning to many people today, but I think your meaning's a little different.
Well, I'm definitely plant-based once removed.
Yeah.
So I like everything I eat to have actually eaten plants along the way. But no, I'm a vegetarian. I just supplement, because I think if you're going to be a vegetarian, you have to supplement, because if you're plant-based, you are going to miss out on nutrients. So I'm a carno, ovo, lacto, pesco, pollo vegetarian. So I supplement with meat, eggs, dairy, chicken and fish. And I find that that's a very, very adequate supplementation. Mm-hmm. It sort of covers all my issues.
Yeah, all the essentials.
And then we were flying across. Well, we used to fly across to the Northern Hemisphere every year, alternate between Europe and the US, and give our talks. And I just got a bit of wind blowing in the background here. I told you it's raining and stormy here. Anyway, I came up with that, that I'm a plant-based, I'm a vegetarian. And then by the end of the flight, Belinda had put it to song. So I'm absolutely lousy. And I think you've seen it on YouTube. Yeah, I am Carno Wovo. Like I said, I'm absolutely tone deaf. But she's very clever and thinks that should be the low carb anthem.
Yes. Well,
But I've actually used that
sure.
in that we were at a children's zoo a few years ago, and there was a young zookeeper there tending a calf, and 5 vegan activists came at her. It was quite ugly, actually. She was just a teenager working at this animal. It was sort of an open park one, and the 5 of them just swamped her. And I actually intervened, and I opened palms, and I said, look, I'm a vegetarian. I'm a plant-based eater, but don't give her a hard time. She's just a kid there that was looking after a calf in a zoo nursery. And so I actually found that I was able to very easily slip into my vegetarian mode in the defense of this young woman. I'm no hero, but it's just, we're all plant-based. I sent you that email about this is almost a segue into, the similarities between the fuel that a cow requires and a gorilla and a human. I was fascinated by this recently. Alan Groves is from the UK, gave a talk on it, and it really pointed out that and it was talking about the length of our guts, the whole intestinal system, and how it varies. So a cow has a lot of fermentation that occurs in the foregut, and a gorilla has it all in the cecum or the hindgut. And so they've got the cows, because this is right up your alley, ruminants. I mean, you should be able to tell me all of this stuff. But ultimately, the preferred fuel of us all is, I'll come back one step. All living creatures have the same biochemical pathway called the Krebs cycle for taking fuel into energy that our body can utilize. And so we take either carbohydrate, protein, or fat, gets converted into acetyl-CoA, goes into the thing called the Krebs cycle, described in the 1930s to 50s. And that's the fuel that we all run on. It doesn't matter if you're an insect or a human or a cow or a gorilla, it's the same energy pathway. That's what links us all up. And as I say, God was not, stupid enough to make us dependent on one of those fuels, which is carbohydrate, which is seasonally available. So we've got this tribrid engine. It's hard to say that, So we can run just as effectively on carbs, proteins, or fats. But as it turns out, the preferred fuel of our body, which is what's able to be sourced naturally, is probably about 70 to 80% fat, 20 to 30% protein, and very little carbohydrate. Because carbohydrate in nature is only seasonally available, and arguably, over the last couple of million years, only available with seasonal fruit. If anybody tries to eat a bit of wheat or grain or barley, it just breaks your teeth.
You might find the honey tree from time to time. But...
Oh yeah, that's right. You've got to find I'm very happy if you want to eat honey, as long as you go and climb the tree in the wild whilst you're naked, right, or in your loincloth. It's an ugly thought, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
But nonetheless, in the loincloth, and you want to get that honey and then suck it out of the wax and break it open with your hands, I'm all for it, okay? Because when you do that, it'll generally be the warmer climate. It'll be the sun will be out, and you'll actually have the sunlight available to metabolize the byproducts of fructose. That's on my inflammation talk. So we don't, without going down that biochemistry. The times of plenty when fruit's available in nature is the time that we're designed to stuff our faces with it, gorge ourselves upon it, drives behavior so that we can turn it into fat for winter hibernation. The trouble is we've now made sugar and carbs available 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And that's why, long and short, we're overweight and obese.
I want to cycle back to the term vegetarian. I think that what's happened is we've taken omnivore and given it this name vegetarian, right? And I think that in part is because we want to think better about being an omnivore. We're still eating animal source foods. It's just some of those we'll eat and feel okay about. Maybe it's because we won't eat red meat and we feel okay eating eggs and poultry and fish and whatever. So that's a vegetarian. You go vegan and that's something else completely. So where did Western concept of vegetarian, quote unquote, and that means veganism by my understanding, but I could be wrong. We could talk about that, drive the score up a little bit. Where did that primarily come from? Because it's not as recent as many people might think it is.
There's a big difference between Eastern and Western vegetarianism. The Eastern vegetarianism, they still eat small amounts of meat, but it's, the animals tend to be at the end of their lives, that it's respected and it's ceremonial, and it's a whole cultural experience there. But as that whole Eastern vegetarianism is drifting, we actually look at the fastest growing rates of obesity and diabetes in the world, and they tend to be associated with those Eastern cultures, China, and Philippines, Thailand, even Japan. So Japan's sort of holding its own at the moment, but they're still in a bit of strife. But the fastest growing rates in the world, are in China. It's not working. Eastern vegetarianism is not working. But Western vegetarianism was born out of religious ideology. And it's not actually based on any science. And that whole red meat, I've actually come up with a hashtag red meat matters. It's just meat. But it comes back to that we've all of a sudden discriminating against meat based on its color. It's politically incorrect, and I realize it's a slightly sensitive topic. But why on earth are we discriminating against red meat versus white meat versus green meat versus orange meat? It's not at a structural level. When you bring everything back to biochemistry, it's just meat. It's a combination of protein, very little carbohydrate in the form of glycogen, and a variety of fats, which are saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat. And the fact that people demonize it because it's red, but you find the same things in avocado. You find, so how can you have saturated fats in avocado that are bad for you and saturated fats in red meat or white meat, which are bad, good, bad? It's not based on science or biochemistry. It's based on opinion. Okay, and this is largely Belinda's work of actually uncovering the vested interests of how we've been shaping our dietary guidelines. And as it turns out, our dietary guidelines started effectively in October 23, 1917, with the formation of the American Dietetics Association. And when you realize that association was pretty well formed by Leonard Cooper, who was had been working for John Harvey Kellogg and Co. leading up to it, and you realize that the dietary guidelines that then followed suit and the dietitians associations of the world that followed suit were all modeled on the American one, and it was started by essentially a vegan woman who was working for a vegan organization. It was called vegetarian at the time, but they were very anti-meat. And the anti-meat agenda stems back to the temperance movement, 1850s, 1860s, which was the demonization of meat by the Adventist Church based on the hallucinations and visions of Ellen G. White, who was their prophetess. Mm. Belinda's work's interesting because when you actually go back to that temperance movement, it was very much the development that the people were coming in from the land to the cities. You couldn't get adequate water because the water sanitation wasn't good. So it tended to be that alcohol became blended into the beers and the rums and the spirits because you could drink that without getting sick. So you then had a whole group of people that were moving into the cities who were slightly drunk all the time. And they got up to mischief because they were away from their families. And the temperance movement came along to try and quell some of those, lustful periods of society. At the same time, you couldn't get fresh meat in the cities, so it would come in from the country and it would be salted and it would actually be bad for you. So this concept of meat being bad for you, meat being evil, was sort of born out of a time when you didn't have refrigeration, you didn't have good preservation techniques, you had long transport period, you had a period of disquiet in society where the menfolk were moving off the land into the cities. And the temperance movement was born. But out of the result of that, the Adventist Church became very powerful and have continued to do so. And they had their thoughts based originally on meat causes masturbation, meat causes violence, meat causes cancer, but it was really probably cancer of the soul rather than cancer of the people, of the body, in retrospect. But nonetheless, that message that meat causes cancer, that then flowed on, back into the early 19th century, that meat causes that cancer, then meat causes cardiovascular disease. And now we've got meat causes climate change. When you realize there's been one group of people, well-meaning, but nonetheless bad science, out there to prove the visions of Ellen G. White, going about their ways. And everyone thinks, okay, who's the Adventist Church? Actually not. The Adventist Church actually turns out to be the second biggest educator in the world after the Catholic Church. They're pacifists. They're all about making that medical education is the right arm of the church. And if you can convince people about the health benefits of living, then you can convince them to come across into the church. They effectively own the cereal industry of the world, or they, initiate it, because it's 101 cereal companies were born at Battle Creek, Michigan, virtually all by the Adventist groups. They effectively own the soy industry of the world. Harry China Miller, spent a lot of time there and then brought soy back. So our soy product, particularly the soy infant formulas, were virtually born out of the Adventist Church. They were heavily involved in the fake meat industry. So the first fake meat analogues were developed by John Harvey Kellogg in 1890s to 1910s. Nut analogues, nut meats. So we've got them, and I'll leave Belinda's thunder there. She's found out another massive area that they're involved in. And they're also vertically integrated now in the farming practices, the food industry, the processed food industry, and then also into the medicinal side. Massive group, highly influential, just sliding underneath the radar. But there's members of they've been advising the US government since the 1920s. Leonard Cooper was the chief dietitian for the US Defense Forces for many, many years, a couple of decades, I think. She was writing the textbooks for the first 30 years of dietetics for the world. We've had people on the Jones Sabat. He's been heavily involved in the latest round of US dietary guidelines and actually involved in that committee of 4 that was looking at the saturated fat meat aspect, without declaring their conflict of interest. You've got people advising the US Congress, the last few US presidents. It's like this, just in the ear. Vegetarian's good, meat's bad, meat causes cancer, meat causes violence, meat causes cardiovascular disease, and this latest drift is meat causes climate change. And you and I know that that's, ruminants are going to save us, not kill us.
So I think it was 88. Let me play the slow pitch guy here and say that, well, gee, I mean, the the Academy of Dietetics, or whatever the name of the organization was, came together and put out a statement that vegan and vegetarian diets could be every bit as healthful as omnivorous diets, including animal source foods. So surely there's, I mean, what's the story of potential conflict of interest along with what you were just talking about with the SDA, and that organization and that statement, that story, to just sort of let people know what it can look like when you, as you said in a recent presentation, when you understand the rule book.
Well, it was both in the US and the Australian guidelines. They both came out with it. But it failed to declare that every author on there was either Seventh-day Adventist, or a couple of them were working for the processed food industry, or both. And so opinion and ideology, it shouldn't come into it. I mean, conflict of interest, you should declare what they are. And most people think of financial, excuse me. But if you're actually going to have a religious ideology and a belief that if you live this way, it will give you salvation and that Christ will return. And I'm not trying to take the mickey out of the Adventists. I mean, people can have their belief. But if it's going to be applied across the board to the wider population, and the dietary guidelines of the US are pretty well implemented then right across the US, and they flow on to most of the Western world. They should be based on science, not on religious ideology.
And
that's it. It's all we've called out.
I mean,
and vegetarianism is not a whole food, nutrient appropriate diet.
Yeah,
because you miss out on stuff.
I mean, no disrespect for anyone's personal beliefs. I think, however, it's fair to be open about what your motives in doing, especially when there is that kind of belief-based conflict. I think it's fair to question it when that becomes a justification for public policy that affects so many things. Many people look at the dietary guidelines. I've heard them say, well, it doesn't really matter, nobody follows them. And in one of your presentations, you made the very clear case that these things can be seen to have effects far beyond what we're told to eat, because everything sort of lines up along with what we're being told we should eat.
Well, I actually think we have followed the dietary guidelines. So everyone, that's the argument. Our society is not following the dietary guidelines. Again, US data, 1974 to 2011, something like that. Long data. In the US, which is pretty well the same here in Australia, you have increased your cereal and grain consumption. You've increased your fruit and vegetable consumption. You've reduced your meat consumption, and you've dramatically reduced your red meat consumption. You've done exactly what you're supposed to do. So when people say, oh, at an individual basis, they're not doing it, as a society, we've done it. And as a society, we've done exactly that. We've gotten bigger, heavier, more chronic disease. #fail. It has not worked. And so that's the argument. And so therefore the argument in the latest US dietary guidelines, let's go even further down the path of this irrational behavior because the people aren't doing it. No, they have done it. Let's do a reverse. At some point in time when you're driving down a superhighway against all the traffic, you will work out it's not a good idea. And this is the thing which astounds me about the medical profession. We're advocating for fresh food, not processed food. I don't know if you've seen, I've been, again, silly enough, arrogant enough to rewrite the dietary guidelines for the world in one sentence. Mm-hmm. I have actually described LCHF keto. I lose my voice when I talk too much. You have to talk more.
Okay.
And we should eat fresh, local, seasonal, whole food based on our culture and environment, reducing added sugar and processed food. That is a description of LCHF keto.
Well, no wonder you're in trouble. You're a radical.
But tell me what's, that's sort of how we evolved over a
Well,
couple of million years.
yeah. So there's a couple things that one could point to, and these are minor quibbles. They're not disagreements. It's just I would point out that there's a large number of people that don't live where the sorts of foods that would be part of an appropriate diet are produced, and there's nothing wrong with consuming them, not processed, but what you could afford, what you could get. There are people who live in parts of the world where they produce, as a fundamental part of their economy, more food than they need. And so part of the commerce system is the exchange of that food through commerce to people in other parts of the world so that people can make a living. So I understand the goal, but I also need to point out that, when you live in a state where there's more cattle than people, for example, a certain number of them are going to go somewhere ultimately. And that's not a bad thing. But I certainly I think I understand the thrust of what you're advocating for. And I think that we could achieve that by going to whatever market is available to us. Again, people live under different circumstances and have different economic realities. And so whatever is affordable and accessible and appropriate, as you said, for their personal background and cultural history and personal choices, there are foods that are available in many, many markets that are appropriate for people who are trying to eat so that they ensure adequate essential nutrition and restore or maintain metabolic health, which are two goals that I think we should all be able to agree on, regardless of where on the diet spectrum we want to place ourselves. Or if we can't agree on those two, then maybe we need to have a deeper conversation, because who would argue about adequate essential nutrition? I understand there's a lot of details underneath each one of those. When you say that, protein intake has remained whatever, I just want to say, yeah, but the red meat's gone down and the poultry's gone up, and we're counting plant source protein as if it's equivalent to animal source protein when everyone understands it isn't. So maybe we're even consuming less, but it's hard to tease that out of the data, right? But those are efforts we can get into. The points of, giving people some guidelines of what they can do so that this doesn't have to be complicated. And I think we were kind of talking about this earlier, that there's a lot now in this kind of metabolic health and human nutrition space where people are, they end up making it too complicated. And so that becomes a barrier to entry for people. And things that make it simpler. So the idea that you express that as is certainly one that makes it, accessible to people. And in that, I can certainly support it.
I sort of say, if it comes in a cardboard box or a plastic bag and has a label on it, you want to avoid it.
Yeah,
and
but
I realize
I'll push back and say that, shredded cheese can come in a plastic bag. That meat, when it comes from the packing plant, not only comes in plastic, but it comes in, cardboard. And, you could argue about that, but part of the fact that happens is I can go to the store and buy high quality, healthful meat for a relatively low cost. And I understand there's lots of other things. We no longer have the meat cutters in every grocery store, plus or minus. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a bad thing. But
I think it's about thinking about, if your food that you buy, you recognize what it comes from.
Yeah.
It's another concept.
Or what it takes to produce it.
Well, that's that whole knowledge base that we're all trying to expand. It almost drifts into the embodied cost of food. Have you heard me talk about that?
No, I don't think so.
So embodied energies is something which is considered in the building industry, so in agriculture, in architecture. So how much it takes to take something out of the ground, turn it into the product that you build with, and then it goes back into the ground. That's the embodied cost or embodied energy of it. And I'd like to think of us as, I'm still trying to find someone who wants to do a PhD in this because I don't have time to do it, is that work out the cost of taking the food out of the ground and then bringing it to us and looking at the health cost of that food. And we may find that an ice cream, instead of being worth $1, is actually should be priced at $20. And a piece of meat, red meat, which is currently priced at $20, should probably be priced at $1. When you look at the whole spectrum of that, because at the moment what we do is the cost of food reflects the cost of production. It doesn't actually reflect the cost of what that food does to us in the long term.
Yeah. So
that's what I'm talking about, the whole life spectrum of a food.
It gets tricky though, doesn't it? Because that's going to, as I was just having a conversation the other day about sustainable healthcare. And that's probably something we could get into, what the healthcare system looks like in your part of the world. But people doing that kind of work frequently onboard the received, wisdom of what constitutes a healthy diet. So when they start looking at the cost of disease, they immediately assume, without examination, that it's, plenty of whole grains, that we have millions of people dying every year from a fiber deficiency, apparently, that they work this stuff out from the nutritional epidemiology studies and say, this is how many people are dying from this diet, so we need to change this one. So with that conversation that I was having with that person, they gave me the figure that in the United States, the average the average pharmaceutical carbon footprint for a type 2 diabetic is 2 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year, which you can work out the math. That's essentially a car. You can work out the math as I have, and I'm waiting to verify it. So tune in for details later, but it might be as much as 50 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent that could be eliminated by getting people off of diabetic medications. And that's, I'll put air quotes around the word just, pharmaceutical cost. That's not the impact on all the other aspects of transport or infrastructure or energy use or medical waste that comes from kidney dialysis, for example, and those many other things. And surely hasn't begun to look at the other aspect of sustainability that needs to be looked at, which is the societal effect of people burdened with chronic disease, shortened lifespan, the impact that has on children, the impact of less activity potential because we're now with artificial limbs, or we're, and it goes on and on. We need lots of people working across this whole space to tell this full story. But clearly the cost of producing food, when we have those conversations, we have to be able to include what's the impact on the people you feed. And by my understanding, from what I've been able to gather by trying to work in that space, we don't go there. We shut it off at the end, at the farm gate or the ranch gate. And then it goes to somebody who processes it. And then it goes to retail. And they can quantify each one of those, but then they all stop. at the human impact, because now you get involved with, people like you and the nutritionists.
Well, at the big picture thing, it's very hard to quantify. At the individual level, it's easy, because when you adopt that lifestyle change, and I'll encourage people down that low carb keto pathway, then you feel the benefits, yourself. You come, this term de-prescribing, you come off medication, so you get a personal saving. We've costed this over and over. It does not cost more to eat this way, because you're buying your fresh, local, seasonal food. You're not buying lots of takeaway. You're not dining out a lot. You're eating your fresh food in your family environment, in your community, all those things which bring together. It's actually not more expensive to eat that way, but you actually get the cost benefits yourself. Number of people who say, look, I don't have to pay for prescriptions and drugs. And in Australia, they're subsidized. Here in the US, they're often not. So if you can come off medications, particularly in the US, you're going to be saving yourself a lot of money. You made me think about something there. Our last dietary guidelines review panel, they asked very specifically 2 questions in the review. One is, what are the benefits of cereal and grain for the people? And the other question is, what are the detrimental effects of red meat consumption? They were only 2 specific questions. It's not what are the benefits and risks of cereal and grain? What are the benefits and risks of meat? It was, what are the benefits of cereal and grain, and what are the detrimental effects of red meat? And they were the questions.
Begging the question, yeah.
Yeah. So this is the whole bias. Now that's the same thing in the US. If you coin the question in one way, you can only get one answer.
Yeah. When did you stop beating your wife?
Yes. Yeah. And so it's just, and so therefore it's this bias that comes into, and most people have got no idea what the dietary guidelines are, let alone how they've been formulated and what questions were being asked of those people who are actually not declaring their conflicts of interest. And this has happened, as I said, since 1917.
And it's accelerating. It seems to me that we're seeing, well, as you've pointed out, that we now don't talk about meat in our guidelines anymore. We talk about protein foods.
And that food, those guidelines determine what's served in hospitals, nursing homes, schools, defense forces, prisons. And if you don't serve that food, and I know we've now got a prison population that's overweight and obese with diabetes, which is having to be medicated.
I forget the exact figure, but a substantial portion of the people who would be eligible age-wise to enlist in the military are not eligible because of weight.
Yes.
So the point's been made that back in World War II era, we had a substantial problem emerging from the Great Depression, where too many potential people were underweight, and now too many are overweight, as well as all the other challenges. I forget the number of the millions of people that the United States government feeds in one way or another every day. And it extends beyond the ones that you mentioned. It guides what foods we subsidize for people of low economic status. And so they can get subsidy to buy exactly the wrong kind of food. And yet, if they, it's a challenge for them to be able to afford the kinds of foods that we would advocate they need to eat more of. Now that's changing. There's little progress, but so these things are critical. As you've mentioned, the people did try to follow them.
But it's also,
in some ways, they were already trying to follow them before they came out, because they had already heard the message that started in the 50s and the 60s about what to eat to be healthy or to protect the environment or what have you.
Well, it's actually repetitive, Peter. I'm as you know, I quite like delving forwards and backwards. I've been doing a lot of reading about about dirt, about our soil,
Yes,
and
please. It's
how
not dirt. No, no, no. Your mother washes dirt out of your clothes. Soil is what we depend on for life.
there's a book called Dirt by Montgomery. I've forgotten his first name, but it's very interesting. The evolution of civilization based on our soil. And pretty well, we've done it over and over and over. Again, Jared Diamond wrote about this in a book called Collapse many years ago. I don't know if you ever read that. If we don't look after our soil, you know, the health of our soil determines the health of our food. The health of the food determines the health of the people. And same thing in the reverse. We have to sort out our soil. And even going back to Roman times, arguably the fall of the Roman Empire was due to its expansion beyond its agricultural capacity. And the erosion of soil came from bad farming practice. And so once we started that whole agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, and we started cropping and graining, we've started introducing not only erosion, but we've actually introduced poor health. So if you look at skeletons before 10,000 years ago, they didn't have osteoarthritis. Arthritis of joints was pretty well non-existent. And apart from the post-trauma, one of our forebears had broken a leg or something and then developed a deformity and problem. But effectively, the changes we see in the bones now weren't that present pre-agricultural revolution. And I was telling you, I've just finished writing a book chapter for this textbook on, and I'm looking at musculoskeletal health issues. And if you look at osteoarthritis of joints, we're now recognizing osteoarthritis is more of an inflammatory condition, more like rheumatoid arthritis, which also tied up integrally with insulin and hyperinsulinemia and that whole metabolic syndrome. But if you look at the microscopic level in the actual cartilage, the damaging material is advanced glycation end products. It is the same end products which are actually associated with diabetes problems. But more importantly, it's a byproduct of carbohydrate ingestion. So we've actually got the damage occurring in our joints as a result of the byproduct of the food we eat. And the same thing actually happens in the tendons that come into our joints, with the rotator cuff, Achilles tendon, tendons around the knee, tennis elbow. When you start looking at those tissues, you find exactly the same end products, advanced glycation end products, causing the damage. What I did not find, and I was trying to look for the one tick, one oval, I could not find those end products in the spine, in the discs of the spine. And I couldn't find them in what's called the menisci of the knee, which are the shock absorbers of the knee. And I thought that would just be wonderful, and it'd just tick all the boxes to say I could blame sugar and carbs on everything. But I can't. Okay, I'll be honest and say, I went looking, cognitive dissonance, whatever you call it. But very clearly there's good science showing that the end products of carbohydrate ingestion are related to our arthritis of joints and tendinitis. There was a very good paper that came out of China earlier this year. So not everything, there are good stuff that comes. And showing that when you increase insulin, you increase inflammation in knee joints. And I know this paper wasn't written by a low carb group, but they were able to show very, very well osteoarthritis of the knee is related to the levels of insulin in the body. And that their argument was we should target insulin in reducing osteoarthritis. Now, you don't need to target insulin. You just need to stop eating carbohydrate. Your body won't produce the insulin. Right. And I've got so many stories of my own patients, and then we add in social media, thousands and thousands and thousands of people who actually have osteoarthritis of joints, knees, hips, shoulders, ankles, hands in particular. They reduce their carbohydrate intake. They lower their insulin levels. Their pain comes under control. They've still got a worn out joint, but they lose their pain, they improve their pain before they lose weight. The bonus is over a longer period of time, they lose weight. This is common. And so when people change their lifestyle and what they eat, and they reduce their carbs, they get that immediate benefit that their joints don't hurt as much.
So there's there was a lecture that I got to hear from a soil scientist, and he was explaining the history of soils in North Dakota. And what he said was the first people to try to farm there were bringing what they knew how to do with them. Understandable. They were from back east, or they were from Europe, and they had just come directly to this part of the continent to try to farm. And so they didn't have, they had farming equipment that wasn't appropriate. They had a mindset that wasn't appropriate. They weren't used to the steady winds that could be there. They didn't have adapted varieties. And so they just began this process of degrading that resource. And then there were dust bowls in North Dakota, which kind of surprised me because I always thought of that as further south in the Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado kind of space. But part of the reason for that lead in is in some aspects of life, when we know better, we do better. Right? That it's hard to blame people for doing something that they didn't know any better about. Right? But now we've got information that in many aspects of life would inform change, and yet not in human health and human nutrition. We're still stuck in what I think you've called generational knowledge or learning. And again, we've met in a certain community of people, so I'm very familiar with what happened to you. But I'm hoping that people from my agricultural communities will get to hear what happened when you started telling people, and forgive me if this is not an appropriate summation, but you're dealing with people who are suffering from wounds due to diabetes, or they have advanced diabetes, or poorly managed blood sugar. And you as a orthopedic surgeon are saying, if you continue this way, this is one likely outcome. And if you try this other way, you may not have to go down that path. And yet you were not, something happened to you. So if you could tell
more
that.
Importantly, I got sick and tired of chopping legs and feet and toes off on a weekly basis. And these patients would be coming to me in my clinic. And it was called Fetke's effed up fructose-free fungating foot folly Friday. I don't know what the effed up meant, okay, but it was but literally every Friday in my clinic there was, and I know it sounds dramatic, but there was a smell of rotting flesh in the clinic. And I worked out this stuff about sugar. You can turn around your diabetes control today, this afternoon, by what you eat or what you don't eat. I'm looking after someone at the moment, one of my mates with his diabetes, and I put one of those glucose monitors on him. And I'm giving him a hard time. He's got to send me the monitor every day. Anyway, guess how long it's taken for us to turn around his diabetes? 6 hours. He's got control of his blood glucose again within 6 hours, just by not eating sugar, carbs, bad food. So in this hospital setting, I've got these patients that I want to actually get them better. Unfortunately, by the time your toes and your feet are rotting off, your brains are rotting as well, your kidneys are gone. It's almost too late. But in the same time frame, I've got a hospital that's serving them ice cream 3 times a day. And I'm going, would you just stop doing it? And I got involved in talking about this. I looked at the science, because once you've got to take on a system, you've actually got to justify it. You've got to look at the science, the biochemistry. You've got to review everything, realize maybe my education's been wrong, which it was. And come back to biochemistry, come back to the Krebs cycle. We can't argue about the old Krebs cycle. It keeps us all alive. Let's just look at that. And along the short of it, in San Francisco airport, I can still remember we were traveling there, and Belinda and my daughter put me on Facebook. Launched a website because we were waiting a few hours layover. And anyway, that's when the war started, okay? Within 24 hours, I had someone from the sugar sweetened beverage industry come after me. Within days, I was getting trolled. And certainly then within a couple of years, as it turns out in retrospect, I had the cereal industry here in Australia directly have me for targeting. And we've got those documents. So it's different when a celebrity chef or someone talks about perils of sugar. But when an orthopaedic surgeon who's sick and tired of amputating things starts getting public airing, and it was, not just social media, there was something in the news, and then there was something on television. All of a sudden, this actually meant something. Here's a surgeon that's sick and tired of it. A bit like the early days of smoking. And all I thought was, I'm just doing the right thing. And I didn't realize that I was going to become a target. I mean, that's my degree of naivety, because it was so flaming obvious. We can turn around diabetes. I was involved in a national TV program where we turned it around. And literally within, on that program, it took us, I think, 8 or 10 weeks to turn someone's diabetes around. He lost about 15 kilograms of weight, came off 5 medications. But you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to get people better. So I ended up being targeted by the cereal industry. I was reported to the medical board 3 times for giving inappropriate advice. And ultimately, a finding was given against me because the expert witness actually was working for Sanitarium, the Adventist Church organisation here in Australia. And we're trying to point out, this guy's biased, your information's wrong, here's the biochemistry, I've pretty well done a PhD on this stuff, I'm not wrong. They said, no, you're an orthopaedic surgeon, you don't know anything about biochemistry, you don't know anything about nutrition, you're wrong. You're completely in it for the money, which we clearly weren't, because I can tell you how many hundreds of thousands of dollars we've lost on this. But effectively, the medical board came down and said, you're not allowed to talk about this ever again, even if it's shown to be best practice. I then became a test case for 2 Senate inquiries into the whole process, bullying and harassment by the system. And it took ultimately nearly 6 years to get the whole thing overturned. And Tim Noakes in South Africa was going through a similar process. We both knew that we had to actually fight on. We both knew that we had to actually win our argument so that others could speak up, because along the way, so many people were saying, I can't talk about low carb, I can't talk about challenging dietary guidelines, I certainly can't talk about keto, I certainly can't talk about helping people with diabetes by nutrition alone. And Anna Dahlqvist in Sweden had been through a similar pathway a couple of years before us. It was really important that we broke the back of this. And that's probably my claim to disclaim, to be of infamity. And Belinda's work was born out of that. She said, look, you and Tim, you're talking about science. All these people around the world, you're talking biochemistry, yet you're getting hammered. And so she started looking at, she originally looked at who was the expert witness who was speaking against me. He seemed like a reasonable guy, but as it turned out, he was working for the cereal industry. And she had no idea, because we originally thought it was just the sugar and cereal and the carb industry after. We had no idea that it was actually all about anti-meat as well. So part of this message of low carbing isn't just to cut your sugar and carbs. You have to replace it with a fuel, and that fuel we're talking about is pro-meat. Mm-hmm. And that's when, if we started delving into religious ideology, we've opened up Pandora's box from a completely naive state of just trying to improve people's health and diabetes by lifestyle change.
There's a government research organization in Australia, I forget the acronym, but while you were going through this, didn't they have a popular publication on the subject?
The CSIRO here in Australia. So right in the midst of it, I've actually got a picture of me in front of a poster where the CSIRO low carb handbook was brought out at the very time that I'm charged and in a Senate inquiry, because we're flying. You remember those days when people used to fly places?
I've heard of them.
And I'm saying, look, here's the picture. Here it is. what's interesting is one of the two authors of that was in our lounge room a couple of years beforehand, and I was explaining the fineries of low carb. So not only am I getting charged and found guilty of the crime of advocating low carb for reversing diabetes, the very author of that book's actually there as Australian bestseller from our peak science body. And if all of that sounds stupid, it is. It's obviously very personal. And people said, oh, he must be dangerous. It must be something else. I go, no, it's just about sugar and carbs. But it was very important for big food / big pharma. I caught up with someone yesterday from the pharmaceutical industry he's working for a diabetes arm. And I can go into a diabetes meeting and they'll know I'm there. Yeah, he actually asked me, he said, oh, were you in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago? Because the word gone out that there was this orthopaedic surgeon that got up and hammered everyone. You know, we can't afford to keep doing what we're doing. We can't afford to keep poisoning the people based on really lousy nutritional advice. And we're happy to call it out.
Yeah,
because it's not sustainable for the people. It's not sustainable for our agriculture. It's not sustainable for our soil. And it's certainly not sustainable for our children and grandchildren. And that's really what it boils down to.
Precisely so. I want to emphasize that sustainability aspect. One, I think that's just been used as a cudgel. I think it's in some ways, as you've already said, first it was cancer, then it was something, then it's this, and it's still that same attitude of it's wrong to eat meat based on what I believe, not on any evidence. I've had people ask me from the audience, and these are people with doctorates, and they'll ask things like, how could we have gotten to this point? And what you've shared is a peek behind the curtain of how this has happened. And it is the reality. And if we're going to get to someplace better, more people have to be at least informed so that more people will be able to push back against what I just see as this increasing message that's part of grade school curriculum now, that it's just a given that, meat is what's driving climate change. And it's just factually incorrect. But it comes in as, well, you want to be healthy too, don't you? I mean, you want the win-win. You want to be healthy and save Earth. And so all of that, you've mentioned websites, so let's make sure that we get the websites named where people could find you, or the work that Belinda's been doing.
I think looking on YouTube, you find most of our talks. I did one last year, which I had to actually do, called The Failure of Medical Education. Do you want the red pill or the blue pill? But that's because when you understand how we've gotten to this, as I say, I base our concepts are based around biochemistry and history. And when you actually understand the biochemistry, then it's a no-brainer. And then when you look at history, you can then work out how on earth have we gotten into this dumb spot. So now I realize that my medical education was corrupted since 1910 by the pharmaceutical industry. Our nutritional education was completely taken on board by a religious ideology. Then I understand how we come to this stuff. But if that's you use the term generational education. That's I came up with that. You believe your teachers, and you believe your teachers before them. You certainly believe your textbooks; they couldn't be wrong. But when it's just been over and over and over, the byline at the end of my email is that science evolves by being challenged, not by being followed. Now, that's what we've got to keep doing. We should never rest on our laurels and actually say, where am I wrong? Where could it be wrong? That's called learning. So Belinda and I both have got YouTube channels where the talks are there. Belinda's work can be found at a website called isupportgary.com, which sounds corny, but she launched that to get me off all of that. I have a website well and truly out of date called nofructose.com. I just need a year off to get it up to date.
But anyway, is it called a cobweb site?
It could be. It could be. Is that 2-1?
No, because I suffer the same thing.
But both of us are very active on Twitter, primarily. So Gary and Belinda Fetke. I find Twitter very useful. It's very quick, gives us information, allows us all to relate. We're both on Facebook. Belinda still has a Facebook page called Belinda Fetke No Fructose, which was taken over from when I was called Gary Fetke No Fructose. We're able to just literally, this is when the whole medical board came down upon me because of that website or that Facebook page was quite powerful. So I just drew a line through Gary and wrote Belinda in handwriting. And I realized I'm just extending my middle finger to the system when we were doing that. But they could do nothing about that because Belinda's an ex-nurse, not registered under the APRA, the medical board, the governing body. So it was really just, okay, you're really going to silence me? Well, Belinda's going to be the voice. And she's you've met her. She's a powerful. I don't mess with her.
You're a smart man.
We're 40 years next week, actually.
Congratulations.
Yeah, so she's a good soul, and her work on uncovering all this. Again, that website isupportgary.com. For those that are interested, it's fascinating, her work that she keeps uncovering. And so, I mean, you'll get her on and she's, far better looking than me and far more interesting.
I'm very much looking forward to that conversation as well. I miss you. I miss you both as plural. I miss a lot of the people that I've gotten to speak through this. So I'm grateful for you giving me the opportunity to kind of touch base again.
Well, look, I can give you a virtual hug here. And we're well and truly at the social distancing at the same time. Okay.
Could we be any more distanced? I don't know. So yeah, there's no way to really cover everything in a reasonable amount of time. I hope that this has been an introduction. I try to tell people that, if we could get this right, I think that everything else is doable. I think that one of my principles is that you can either focus on minimizing human impact or you can focus on maximizing human flourishing. And I think that we can get to minimized impact through the maximizing flourishing because, prosperous societies can afford to invest in conservation and those sorts of efforts. Not
can afford, must.
Well, indeed, yes. Indeed, yes. But if you have a top-down approach that says, oh, we know what's best, therefore you must do this, then you find the nonsense of putting the world on a macrobiotic diet because that's going to save the earth. And when in fact, what we know is it's going to harm human beings. It's going to restrict their development and their potential and all sorts of other things. This has been demonstrated and documented. I've yet to find anyone who can point me towards a high quality piece of evidence pointing to the hazard, the health or harms to humans coming from too much animal source food in the diet. I have a stack of high quality evidence pointing toward the harms that come from too little. And I think that a lot of what we've been seeing is exactly that lack, but we haven't yet gotten people to look at it that way. They're looking for other things. And so I'm impressed by people who are talking to me about hyperinsulinemia as being a unifying theory of chronic disease. And until we've addressed that, I'm not persuaded that we can know anything else really about human health impacts until we've addressed the 80% of the signal, right? The other things, I'm sure they're there, but how could you tell that if you haven't addressed that massive insult?
It goes back to the primary root cause. Treat the big picture stuff. The elephant in the room, literally, is hyperinsulinemia. But if you're waiting for a top-down approach, our work's identified how much of a struggle that's going to be. It's not a conspiracy theory if it's a fact.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, it's also just confluence of interests doesn't have to be a conspiracy. It's what it does.
It's not going to change. However, the individual can change today.
Yes.
And take that to yourself, to your family, lead by example. Or as Belinda says, hashtag be noisy with me. It's literally, that's what it's about. Individuals can make the decision as to what their future is going to be today. For the vast majority of people, we're very fortunate, you're in the US, I'm in Australia. We have the ability to make those choices. Many people around the world don't.
Yeah, and
but
I'm
unless we lead by example, we don't have any hope. And that's
the Noakes Foundation, Eat Better South Africa. These sorts of things need to be replicated in other parts of the low and middle income countries, because this is what the 2050 sort of point is, that we need to increase the affordability, access of animal source food. We need to increase the efficiency of those systems so that lowers the environmental impact, all of those things. But we need to understand who is going to be speaking against that and why. And for that, your example and Belinda's research are invaluable. So thank you both.
Everyone's invited to my table to eat. You just need to identify which hat you're wearing.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
And a lot of people, to be fair to the system, a lot of people don't know which hat they're wearing. Because if you've had your education completely conflicted, and if everything around you has been telling you one thing, then because there are a lot of doctors, and I'll use that example, who have heard my talk about the failure of medical education, gone, oh my God, really? Really? Have I been conned? And it's the same thing, those doctors who come on board with low carb or keto, or not just doctors, but healthcare professionals, they get angry, first of all. I don't know if you've seen that. They go through an angry phase of going, I've been conned. I've actually done harm to my patients. That's what I did. I used to be the cake judge. I'm sorry. I'm here. All of I'm doing now is to try and make amends to all of those people I poisoned by encouraging chocolate cake consumption.
Sod Father grants you dispensation.
over a fine steak, okay?
Yes, exactly. I say that there are some people are sincerely wrong. They believe what they're saying and doing. And that's a caution to me, because I could be that. I am in some aspects. But there are people involved here who know the truth, and yet they persist in the lie.
I don't want to drop this guy in the pickle too much. But if you work for a pharmaceutical industry, I actually know a few people in this spot, so I'm not dropping an individual in there. I know some people who've left the pharmaceutical industry, so they can't stay there because they know there's a better way. They cannot go to work prostituting themselves. Well, that's a big word, okay? When they know that they can actually get people better by just changing the way they eat. And that's and those people who've left those industries, they're brave souls because they put their pay packet on the line.
Mhm.
And arguably, that's what we did along the way. One of the arguments I had was, if I'm really dangerous, deregister me.
Mm.
Otherwise, apologize. And ultimately, I got the apology. But it
And
took 6 years before they realized actually maybe he wasn't wrong.
yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
No, I'm pretty sure you weren't. So thank you. Um, I've
But
really,
I couldn't do that without Belinda. I
of
couldn't do
course
that
not.
without you. I couldn't do it without the hundreds of thousands of people that expressed their support to us along the way. Because you know that a lone voice doesn't have any chance. So social media may have been my crime, but it was also my savior.
Hmm.
The people got behind this,
Yes.
and for that we'll be forever grateful for that.
And a recent conversation, they gave me that this is the decade of data over dogma.
Yes,
And I hope that's true. And seeing just what you related, and hopefully we can all find some way to make that a reality so that this situation can be reversed. And again, thank you for your time and what you've been doing. And I sent Belinda a hug. I hope you've delivered it. I'll check. So,
it'll be a hell of a lot more personal than the one I gave you. Okay.
okay, good, good. Thank you so much, my friend, and all the best.
All the best for you in continuing this podcasting journey. And I hope you reach out. As we talked about, this is about getting the message out of the bubble, out of the echo chamber, and moving it beyond.
That's the hope.
Great to see you, Peter. Bye bye, mate.
Likewise. Bye bye.